this is, I want to start, this is the first image from a short documentary film I came across while researching this. It's called Real Estate for Ransom. And I'm not going to go into what it means, but this really kind of very nicely for me captures the sort of import of my argument about cash transfers. So with that, here we go. Given the innumerable needs and desires to which money can be applied, cash transfers have been deployed in recent years as a flexible response to acute economic crises around the world, such as following the widespread floods that affected Colombia in 2011 to the rupture of the Brumadinho Dam in Brazil in 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic has been no exception, as dozens of governments around the world have deployed cash transfers in some form or another in response to unemployment and other economic losses triggered by the pandemic. This recent deployment of cash transfers has intensified conversations about universal basic income. Some scholars and activists view UBI as a strategy for, quote, detaching livelihoods from work, as the late David Graeber put it, or as a rational necessity given the pending demise of the labor market through automation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Studies of basic income show increases in well-being, even cognitive functioning, as people have to worry less about how they will buy food, pay their bills, and pay their rent. Aggregate poverty indicators immediately rise or fall without any lag as cash transfers are switched on, turned off, or cut back, which points to what I have elsewhere described as the defeasibility or cancelability of gains in social well-being that are achieved by different kinds of redistributive programs. The cancelability of gains achieved by basic income programs is illustrated in a statement from a woman who participated in a basic income pilot study in Finland as the program was coming to a close. She says, "Oh my God, basic income is coming to an end. What do I do now? I'm so worried I can't pay my loans. Oh, I'm so worried that my finances will collapse completely." A rural Brazilian woman interviewed in the documentary film Disruption similarly commented that if Brazil's conditional cash transfer program, Bolsa Família, were to suddenly end, then her life would return to the, quote, same suffering, just like before the program began. The goods that cash transfers can achieve are thus particularly subject to prevailing political moods, government budgets, and even research funding. The need for cash transfers makes particular sense, though, in a world where the basic means of life are controlled by a restricted minority of actors, humans and corporations. Cash transfers, including UBI, can thus be viewed from a different standpoint as a culmination of what Marx, following the 18th and 19th century political economists, called primitive accumulation. Whereas primitive accumulation achieved an initial and forcible separation of people from their control over the basic means of life, rendering them into wage laborers, cash transfers become necessary as a proxy for wages in order to stabilize such relations of production in moments of crisis. When economic systems enter crisis, in other words, cash transfers help to keep the unemployed, the underemployed, and the furloughed clothed, housed, and fed. But there's more. As wage laborers become increasingly dispossessed from these historically enforced roles as employees through automation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, cash transfers also help to ensure that they nonetheless remain consumers, whose new role is to serve as purchasers of goods and services available on the market. Thus, the same cash transfers that keep people fed and housed during crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, simultaneously ensure that landlords maintain their rent incomes while keeping up with mortgage payments that increase their equity in rental properties. As is well known, Adam Smith described the original, quote, accumulation of stock leading to capitalism as a peaceful process that occurred through the nascent capitalist diligent labor, which occurred prior or previous to the division of labor itself. Smith's previous accumulation was filtered through German in Marx's Das Kapital, where it was revealed as a violent process before returning to the English language as primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation achieves two outcomes. First, it concentrates ownership or control of the means of production in the hands of fewer and fewer people through the dispossession or dissolution of private property based on the labor of its owner. Second, and against Smith, this dispossession simultaneously creates a division of labor rather than preceding it. People who can no longer make an independent living find themselves dependent on capitalists who had usurped control of the means of production. The primitive accumulation of capital thus simultaneously involves the formation of a class of wage laborers through their separation from the means of production. Free transactions between employers and employees in the labor market are thus grounded in historical moments of coercion and sometimes outright violence. As various scholars have noted, typically following Rosa Luxemburg, processes of primitive accumulation are historically ongoing. In earlier publications, I've described processes of primitive accumulation that occurred through a land grab in southern Bahia, Brazil, where I do ethnographic research, which took place in the early 1950s through the 1970s. This land grab was inaugurated by the late Norberto Odebrecht, the founder of the Odebrecht Group, which is at the center of ongoing criminal investigations for its role in one of the largest international corruption schemes in history. Odebrecht accumulated stock and capital on Bahia's southern coast, initially by securing contracts to build and upgrade seaports in the region, which eventually led him to recognize the region's untapped natural wealth. According to a December 1983 issue of the company magazine Odebrecht Informa, it states that Norberto Odebrecht confesses that he became enchanted with the riches and beauty of the region, but mostly with the riches, including a 63-meter waterfall, which was surrounded by dense tropical rainforest, all of which was an invitation to diversify the business by generating hydroelectric power and working with forest products. Odebrecht extracted timber, accumulated and speculated on land, and eventually invested in plantation rubber and cacao cultivation. This diversification for Odebrecht, however, meant the end of a way of life for the rural families who inhabited the region's hills, losing their land and livelihoods in the process. Many of the families were former slaves or their descendants who made a living by cultivating manioc gardens in the region's forests. Their dispossession was the secret behind the hard work behind Norberto Odebrecht's rise. Odebrecht did not, of course, do all of this alone. The work of dispossessing local families was carried out by forest guards who enforced prohibitions on local families' productive activities, preventing them from collecting firewood or clearing swidens to plant manioc gardens. As one woman noted in an interview, we couldn't even light a fire in those woods. If they saw smoke, they'd come harassing us. So the people were all at a standstill, unable to do anything, nothing at all. Eventually, these prohibitions turned into expropriations as local families were dispossessed of their land. Stories about homes being deliberately burned down circulated widely in this period, echoing Marx's descriptions of the Highland clearances in Scotland, including the story of the, quote, old woman who was burned to death in the flames of the hut she refused to leave. But Odebrecht's secret was about more than just the seizure of timber, water resources, and land. It was also about the consolidation of a dependent labor force. A man named Jeremias, a local man who was one of Odebrecht's primary land brokers, who was tasked with removing families from land that Odebrecht kept for himself, he made this point explicit. He said, switch the slide. He said, many of the people that we dispossessed, they stayed in the same place where they were before. We bought their possessions, drew up the documents, and we permitted them to stay there. but they had to work for us. So what he's saying, in other words, is that these are some photos from the region from about the late 1980s, early 1990s, and probably looks something like, architecturally, something like what these houses that were burnt down would have looked like. But what Jeremias is saying basically is that they basically forced people off the land, but they let them stay in these same houses but a condition of their residence there was, of course, that they had to go to work for Odebrecht on Odebrecht's plantation. So without any meaningful alternative, this incidentally, this is a photo of the worker housing that was later on built on the regional Firestone plantation, which followed Odebrecht in the 1950s in the region. So without any meaningful alternative, the threat of hunger and destitution compelled many members of these dispossessed families to work for Odebrecht and for other plantations that expanded into the region in the 1960s and the 1970s. Thus, as Marx writes, the indispensable social dependence of the worker on the capitalist was secured. And this dependence was achieved by the threat of destitution and the threat of hunger. The 18th and 19th century political and moral economists, as Michael Perelman shows, made this threat of hunger into a virtue, as hunger could stir the poor from their idleness and compel them to go to work for wages. As Reverend Joseph Townsend, who Marx cites, put it in 1786, it is only hunger which can spur and goad the poor on to labor. And he continues, hunger is not only a peaceable, silent, unremitted pressure, but also the most natural motive to industry. It calls forth the most powerful exertions. Primitive accumulation thus works through the constant threat of hunger and destitution, cutting through traditional lifeways like scissors, Michael Perelman writes. The first blade served to undermine the ability of people to provide for themselves. The other blade on the scissors was a system of stern measures required to keep people from finding alternative survival strategies outside the system of wage labor. Here, we think of vagrancy laws, laws against poaching, the enclosure of common lands, the cancellation of feudal so-called usage rights, the prohibition of gleaning after the main harvests, for example, or the forest guards that I just described earlier. Primitive accumulation is thus the forcible creation of a class of free and rightless proletarians, as Marx wrote, the bloody discipline that turned them into wage laborers. Their dependence, moreover, is maintained by preventing people from being able to make a living otherwise. And in the historical wake of primitive accumulation, Perelman writes, the wage relationship eventually seems like a voluntary affair. Some of the earliest arguments for basic income rose from the recognition of dispossession, as can be seen in Thomas Paine's 1795 pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, in which he famously proposed a national fund out of which there shall be paid to every person when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of 15 pounds sterling as a compensation in part for the loss of his or her natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property. Note that Paine's proposal, which in today's terms amounts to about 1,800 pounds sterling when adjusted for inflation, Paine's proposal does not negate, but rather proceeds on the basis of taxing that land that had been, quote, dispossessed. And this is Paine's term. Paine does not propose to redress the disposition itself, but rather to make it more bearable. So much for restorative justice. In the 20th century, both Martin Luther King Jr. and the conservative economist Milton Friedman defended different visions of a guaranteed income. King proposed a guaranteed income to, quote, combat the dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination. Friedman, for his part, proposed a negative income tax as establishing a floor below which no man's net income could fall. Such a policy, Friedman argued, would reduce the total administrative burden involved in what he called the rag bag of welfare programs by substituting them with the negative income. In this latter respect, Friedman's proposal is similar to the UBI recently proposed by US presidential candidate Andrew Yang, whose $1,000 monthly freedom dividend would replace the, quote, hodgepodge of US social programs. Similarly, David Graeber's vision of UBI would quote, massively reduce the amount of bureaucracy, including the extraordinarily expensive system of what he called bullshit jobs. Yang's UBI proposal in particular would be funded by a value-added tax, unlike Payne's, which is based on a land tax. And the burden of Yang's UBI would therefore be mostly carried by lower income families, since they spend disproportionately large portions of their income on consumer goods. But ultimately, this is Yang's selling point. If not as wage laborers, then people will at least be maintained as consumers. And in an interview that he gave, I think this was from the Joe Rogan podcast, he states the following. He says, if everyone in Missouri is getting $1,000, you know Amazon's going to see some of that because they're going to buy more stuff. That's true for all of the big companies. What I say to CEOs, and I've spoken to groups of dozens of CEOs, what I say is that what's really bad for your business is when people don't have money to spend. What's good for your business is when they do. So they're gonna give up some money at the top, but they're just gonna end up getting it back when their consumers end up spending a bit more. Now, this is not a theme that is isolated in Yang's proposal. While Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of UBI was certainly superior, after all, he wasn't trying to sell his idea to corporate CEOs. King nonetheless employed similar language. He writes, "We have to come to the point where we must make the non-producer a consumer, or we will find ourselves drowning in a sea of consumer goods. We have so energetically mastered production that we now must give attention to distribution. People must be made consumers by one method or another." Another point on which analysts and commentators across the political spectrum agree is that the labor market is threatened by advances in automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. In the US, Bain Capital estimates that 20 to 25% of current jobs will be lost by the end of the decade, particularly affecting lower income workers. Even better earners, such as big rig truck drivers or radiology technicians, may also be replaced by self-driving vehicles and artificial intelligence that can read the X-rays. Some observers even suggest that legal practices, the practice of law, including work done by paralegals and those in legal research positions, will be adversely affected by AI. The McKinsey Group estimates that 38 million jobs, full-time jobs in the US could be displaced by automation by 2030, 15 million jobs in Brazil, 9 million jobs displaced in Germany, 56 million in India, and 111 in China. Some observers recently suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic is accelerating these trends, since machines can't get sick from COVID. Analyses of automation invariably suggest that automation will simultaneously lead to the creation of new kinds of jobs, while those dispossessed of their former professions will have to be re-educated and repurposed. But experience with retraining programs have been anything but stellar, at least in the US, which is why many commentators simply suggest that people will have to be supported through cash transfers. Automation, machine learning, and AI thus amount to another dispossession, through the desocialization and literal dehumanization of work, and undoing of social relations established by primitive accumulation, and arguably an undoing of capitalism itself. Those who are descended from earlier generations of people who were forced into roles as wage laborers now find themselves dispossessed of what had become their birthright. They are thus doubly dispossessed. Not only did their ancestors lose control of the means of subsistence and production in previous episodes of primitive accumulation, including their land and homes, but current generations are increasingly losing out on opportunities for wage labor. Thus, the necessity for basic income as a way of making the situation bearable. Taken to an extreme, these future visions of automation point to a society in which labor power becomes increasingly sidelined. Incidentally, the basis for the Marxian labor theory of value and capitalism itself will both cease to exist, as we would be looking at something else altogether. Marx writes, without a class dependent on wages, there can be no production of surplus value. Without the production of surplus value, there can be no capitalist production, and hence no capital and no capitalist. So I think that follows from how Marx understood the kind of social configuration of capitalism. Now, this dissolution of capitalism can proceed along two general lines or in a couple different directions. One of them, and probably more beyond that, one of them, the first, this dissolution could be achieved by working people. If Marx gets his way, then individuals will finally confront each other as free persons. If David Graeber gets his way, livelihoods will become detached from work, severing the tie of workers to capitalists that were established in processes of primitive accumulation. Graeber writes, a full basic income would eliminate the compulsion to work by offering a reasonable standard of living to all, and then either leaving it up to each individual to decide whether they wish to perform or pursue further wealth by doing a paying job or something else, or whether they wished to do something else with their time. But the severance described by Graeber is only partial. Most people devote much of their income to buying food through the industrial food system. But equally, if not more important, one of the largest proportions of people's incomes goes to paying rents for living space. Alternatively, another direction, the need for UBI could simply arise through the dissolution of capitalism in favor of the owning class. If this latter case, which is substantially the story that we get about automation, then the form of dependence on wage laborers on capitalists ceases, while their survival is transferred to some other dependence, maybe to the state, or maybe to Amazon or to Google. So in the United States, the responses to COVID to the COVID-19 pandemic have included proposals to either suspend and or cancel rents or mortgage payments, as has been done in the UK and Italy, for example. But the mere suspension of mortgage payments without simultaneous suspension of rent payments favors mortgage holders and disadvantages renters. In the case of suspension, mortgage holders, including landlords, do not further accumulate debt, whereas the suspension for renters merely leads to the accumulation of debt in the form of back rents. The suspension of evictions and foreclosures during the pandemic in the US has basically had the same effect, and observers expect evictions in the US to skyrocket after restrictions on evictions are lifted. We will probably see similar outcomes to the foreclosure crisis after 2008, which led to a contraction of wealth among African American homeowners who were disproportionately affected by the crisis. Some U.S. politicians, such as U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, have proposed the outright cancellation of payments, both for rents as well as for mortgages, which is a more equitable solution, as it puts the entire system of payments on hold. It would not lead to the accumulation of debt for renters, homeowners, or landlords, while preventing any negative impact on credit ratings or rental histories. But in the absence of any concerted policy approach in the US, thousands of renters and homeowners have already fallen behind on rent and mortgage payments. To make matters worse, the first cash transfers or stimulus checks that were approved in the US under the CARES Act were subject to different kinds of seizure. Some such seizures were morally justified, such as for making late payments for child support. But others were also subject to seizure by private debt collectors. Although the CARES Act delivered hundreds of billions of dollars to US taxpayers facing financial hardship, the pandemic has nonetheless meant increased numbers of credit defaults for people who were suddenly employed and so on. This has been a boon. This has been a windfall for debt recovery companies, which buy defaulted credit card debts for pennies on the dollar. According to reporting by ProPublica, debt recovery companies such as Encore Capital Group made record profits in 2000. Encore's CEO, in a phone call reporting, I think, on their second quarter earnings, suggested that the company is particularly excited about prospects for increased supply in the future. That supply, of course, is people who have defaulted on their credit cards. Stimulus payments from the CARES Act thus made it easier to collect debts from households that were in crisis from the pandemic. Brazil's response to the pandemic, by contrast, has been far more rational. In March, the Brazilian federal government approved emergency aid payments that were initially funded for 3 months between April to June 2020, then extended through August, and then extended once more from September to December 2020 to the end of this past year. The program was targeted to low-income, unemployed, and informal workers and micro-entrepreneurs, all above 18 years old. People receiving pensions, Social Security, or disability payments were not eligible for the emergency aid payments. Those receiving Bolsa Familia payments, however, could simply increase their benefit. Payments between April and August were 600 reais per adult for a total of 1,200 per household, while single mothers were eligible to receive the full 1,200 reais for themselves. From September to December, the base payment was reduced by half to 300 reais, or 600 reais per household. 67.8 million Brazilian families received this emergency aid, affecting nearly half of Brazil's total population, whereas beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia, to give some perspective on scale, only benefits some 15 million. As of August, emergency aid in Brazil was the sole source of income for some 44% of Brazilians who received the benefit, and 36% of Brazilians as of December. The emergency aid policies had an immediate effect on poverty rates in Brazil. Economic research suggests that emergency aid payments temporarily brought Brazil to its lowest poverty rate ever, according to World Bank measures for poverty and extreme poverty. So you could see here in this chart the poverty rates at 2004, 2019, and then they became the lowest in 2020 as a result of these emergency aid payments. Other figures suggest that 13.1 million people in Brazil were immediately lifted out of poverty. However, the reduction of the amount of emergency aid payments from 600 reais per month to 300 immediately threw somewhere between 7 to 11 million people back below the poverty line. Right. So this is this kind of this idea of cancelability, this defeasibility that I've been thinking through recently. Without the EA payments, the emergency aid payments, the average income of Brazilian employees would have dropped by at least 18% on average, most severely, however, affecting informal, low-income, and self-employed workers. By contrast, with the emergency aid payments in hand, some analysts estimate that the average income of workers increased by some 24% when compared to incomes prior to COVID-19, while those without formal education experienced income increases of upwards of 156% due to these emergency aid payments. The authors of that particular study conclude, of course, that this does not mean that the emergency aid payments are excessive, but that the level of poverty and inequality in Brazil is very high. The economic losses caused by measures to control the spread of COVID-19 in Brazil were particularly acute for informal and self-employed workers and low-income families generally, who were not able to work from home. These families are also disproportionately represented among those who pay rent for their housing and are more significantly impacted by increased prices of food and other consumer goods. A recent descriptive analysis by Brazilian economist Sergio Firpo suggests that among 69 million Brazilian families, only 17 of them pay rent for housing, totaling 11 million, for a total of 11 million families in Brazil that rent, which by comparison to the United States is I believe that's somewhat small. However, whereas the lowest income stratum in Firpo's analysis, which is defined as earning up to 2 minimum monthly salaries, whereas this stratum accounts for 24.3% of the total population in Brazil, this stratum is slightly disproportionately represented among those who pay rent, accounting for 29% of all renters. Perhaps more importantly, while renters in Brazil devote on average 20% of their income to paying housing rents, the total portion of income devoted by this lowest stratum to rent payments is 34% of their total income. The EA payments, the emergency aid payments, thus played a significant role in stabilizing renters' access to housing. Their marginal position within society, as well as the meager amount of emergency aid, especially after it was cut, meant that people had to make choices. As one person interviewed in the media explained, in the pandemic, there were constant delays of 1-2 months until they stopped everything. And there are people who've been evicted, while others are taking food from their children's mouths just so they can pay rent, so they don't have to live on the street. I myself, I live alone, but I have a young daughter. It's really difficult. We're not able to work. Another family was similarly no longer able to pay rent at the outset of the pandemic, as one man named Juscelio explained. He says, either we paid our bills or we bought food. His particular family went on to live in a squatter settlement, I think it was in Sao Paulo, where they, together with dozens of other families, were later on forcibly removed by the municipal government to make way for a construction project. Increasing austerity in housing policies, such as in Sao Paulo, including cuts in rental subsidies, have exacerbated the situation going into 2020. In June of 2020, the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, vetoed a proposed law that would have prevented evictions during the pandemic. And so by December 2020, one organization, the Zero Eviction Campaign, had documented over 6,000 families that had been evicted, which is certainly a conservative number for Brazil. One man living in Sao Paulo, for example, whose rental subsidy had been cut earlier in 2020, had to take his young family to live in a squatter settlement in the forests on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. He said, either we paid rent or we fed our children. We had no choice. We couldn't let them die of hunger, right? So this whole theme of this threat of destitution and hunger. There's no doubt that emergency aid payments prevented cases like these from multiplying further. But when emergency aid payments finally became available in April, the municipal government in the northern city of Natal, in the north of Brazil, weaponized these payments against a local squatter settlement. Municipal administrators there pressured families occupying an abandoned municipal building to leave, claiming that now that they had these emergency aid payments, they now had the money to pay rent to landlords. So they should leave the occupation. However, Brazil's emergency aid payment program came to an end just a couple weeks ago, at the end of December in 2020. And now many people will be forced to choose between survival and their health, feeding children or paying landlords, taking to life on the streets or staying home. To be sure, the end of this program will be catastrophic in the coming weeks and months for many families in Brazil. We'll see what happens, I guess. The purchasing power of these emergency aid payments, moreover, has also been squeezed throughout 2020 by price inflation and probably price gouging and profiteering, especially for food and other key consumables, such as cooking gas. So when we look at data, there's all sorts of data in Brazil, lots of reporting on this, showing really kind of rapid price increases in food over the course of 2020. And families, low-income families, are forced, therefore, to devote greater and greater portions of their incomes or these emergency aid payments to food. So there's all sorts of data about this. So, for example, these are some of the inflation rates for different kinds of key products: soybean oil, rice, sugar, and so on. And some data that I've been collecting myself in a much less kind of scientific fashion. I've also seen pretty remarkable price increases as well. So if we look at the price of beans in the middle of the year, they were up by about 89% in southern Bahia compared to the prices that people remembered paying before the onset of the pandemic. It's come down now a little bit in Salvador, and I don't have as much good current data on Salvador, but the price actually seems to be slightly less. That may be an outlier. Most of the prices by December, January have come down slightly from what they were, but the prices for different kinds of meats, for example, continue to rise, and the price of cooking gas also continues to rise. And there are, of course, different kinds of explanations for these rises in the food prices. But what this amounts to effectively is a destruction of the buying power of transferred cash. So I'll conclude with this last section here. So with every paycheck, week after week, month after month, each paycheck continuously reaffirms a bifurcated society that was established through processes of primitive accumulation. Into the future, it seems possible and perhaps likely that policymakers, by which I mean Amazon, Google, and Uber, will convince governments to implement some form of a basic or guaranteed income, which will be especially important for those who lose their jobs to automation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Cash transfers cash transfers as a substitute for wages thus express the further dispossession of people stripped of their role as wage laborers, reduced to a role as consumers, so as to guarantee the continual consumption of products offered on the market. Instead of providing labor power, they will provide buying power. No longer workers, but consumers. So what do cash transfers achieve? During the COVID-19 pandemic, cash transfers helped to keep many children fed and helped to keep many families in their homes. And that is a good that in itself is really unassailable. Brazil's system of emergency aid payments, which approximated a universalized basic income, temporarily lifted millions of people above the poverty line. But after the payments ended, many families fell once again below the poverty line, returning to the same suffering, if not worse, as before the program began. But this isn't the point. My argument is certainly not that cash transfers are bad. Rather, cash transfers are necessary so that tenants do not fall behind on their rent payments and run the risk of eviction. And to be sure, of course, my concern here is with those who are propertyless in society, who do not have homes of their own, who do not have land of their own, who suffer the disproportionate burden of crises caused by things like COVID-19. But if we take a step back and look beyond the way that cash transfers keep marginalized families whole, it also becomes clear that cash transfers are perhaps even more necessary to keeping landlords whole, as most of the cash payments will go to maintaining rental incomes while increasing landlord equity in their own properties. So here it's helpful to recall justifications of cash transfers made by people like Andrew Yang, right, who had said, what I say to CEOs, and I've spoken to groups of dozens of them, right, is that you're going to get that money back. Right? It's going to come back to you. So in our analyses of cash transfers, we cannot merely consider the standpoint of those people to whom they are directly paid. We have to look at those who will indirectly end up receiving that cash. Cash transfers are thus a continuous reaffirmation of a bifurcated society. In a sense, UBI does represent the decommodification of cash. Cash reappears as a basic income instead of something that is received in exchange for work, right? That's not a commodity exchange, right? But if livelihoods are thus detached from work, as Graeber puts it, then living space must also be decommodified so that dwelling is similarly detached from rent. Otherwise, landlords will continue to increase their equity in properties that they rent out to tenants, and tenants will continue to purchase that equity, but not for themselves, but for their landlords. But now with basic income payments instead of with wages. And that's all. Thank you, guys.